hand over to Angela to introduce Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who we're delighted to be hosting this afternoon.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great honour to have Bernardo with us. Thank you so much for coming.
Pleasure.
And yes, we discovered Bernardo's work several years ago in the course of teaching MA in mythic cosmology and the sacred at Christchurch. And Bernardo is one of these thinkers like Ian McGilchrist and Bev Kripal, perhaps, who has quite an amazing mind that can encompass everything, beyond all limitations of science and philosophy, really, and current thinking. And also, champions the power of the imagination as a faculty of knowing. And that's why we particularly wanted to talk to him today about his book, More Than Allegory, which probably a lot of you have read if you've been associated with the because it does concentrate on the power of symbol and metaphor to open up a particular way of knowing, which does go beyond, all sort of disciplinary limitations, really. And there are many, many questions that it raises, huge questions, which we can't possibly cover everything today. I'll just give you a very brief introduction to Bernardo himself, although probably most of you know a bit about him. He's the Executive Director of the Essentia Foundation, which promotes the work of philosophical idealism. And his work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He's a PhD in philosophy and in artificial intelligence. And as a scientist, Bernardo has worked for the European Organization for Nuclear Research and the Phillips Research Laboratories, where he laid his work in detail in many academic papers and books. His books he's written on Meaning in Absurdity, Dreamed Up Reality, Rationalist Spirituality, Grief Peaks Beyond, Materialism is Baloney, More Than Allegory, The Idea of the World, and more recently, Decoding Schopenhauer's metaphysics and Decoding Jung's metaphysics, and Science Ideated. So idealism argues the case of a universal mind, or mind at large, which is the primary ground and origin of all matter. And in this, Bernardo follows in the footsteps of the Platonic and Hermetic philosophies, critiquing the contemporary dominance of a materialist worldview. And that's another reason, of course, why we're so interested in his work, and particularly in this book. So I guess that to sort of get things going, the first thing I'd like to ask you, Bernardo, is that you mentioned in one of your interviews that More Than Allegory was your favourite book. Could you tell us a bit more about why that is?
In most of my other books, I try to make a very explicit case for the argument I'm putting forward. So I just follow logic, evidence, and I try to be as internally consistent and explicit as possible. But of course, not everything that is salient about what's going on, about reality, about ourselves, is amenable to precise, explicit description or reasoning in language. There is a lot that we can know by or through embodied feeling, through intuition, a form of perception that transcends what we normally call perception. Through all these natural faculties we all have, because we are natural beings, we are rooted in nature, there's a lot more than we can sort of corral into words in an internally consistent, clear, unambiguous, and precise way. So when you sort of abandon the need to be very consistent, unambiguous, and explicit in your reasoning, you can say more by hinting at more. And that's what I did in More Than Allegory. It was the one book, well, Dreamed Up Reality, I did that too a little bit, and in Meaning in Absurdity also a little bit. But even those two other books are wrapped into explicit and ambiguous conceptual reasoning ultimately. And More Than Allegory has some of that, but I gave myself a lot of freedom to try to hint at things that can be known but cannot be communicated unambiguously.
Great. Well, you focus very much on the question of the power of religious myth to reveal truths that can't be revealed any other way. I wonder if you could say something about the differentiation between myth, truth, and belief, as you describe them in this book, because obviously that's the theme that the book hinges around, the truth that's in myth. Could you say something about what that means?
You were breaking up a little. Let me see if I understood the question. You want me to talk about the difference between myth and religion?
Truth,
truth and belief.
Oh, yeah. Truth and belief. Okay. All religion, I think, is, at least at first, fundamentally based in a form of mythology. And what is a myth? I mean, today myth has acquired a bad rap. It's a word that is used today as a synonym for untruth, for fiction, for fantasy. That's not the original meaning of the word myth. Myth is a metaphorical or symbolic way to convey a first-person insight, a first-person experience to somebody else. Because that experience is ineffable and cannot be described precisely, what we do is we hint at it by using words not in a literal manner, but in a manner that highlights some sort of commonality between what you're saying and what you're actually trying to describe. For instance, I may say, time is a river, which is literally untrue. A river is a river. Time is something else. Time is not a river. But when we say time is a river, what we are trying to do is to point out at something about the river that is the same as something about time. And in this specific case, we can be very explicit about it. And we can say time is a river, metaphorically, because both flow. We have the concept flow, which is precise and unambiguous, to highlight the commonality that the metaphor is trying to hint at. So we don't need the metaphor. We can just say time flows. We don't need to say time's a river. But there are many instances in which there is no alternative for time is a river. We don't have the concept of flow. Language didn't evolve to embody that concept in its shared dictionary. So we have to stick to time is a river. So when people have first-person religious experiences, which are at the root of every major religious tradition, all they could do is say, time's a river, because there is no flow to replace the metaphor with. So you have to stick to the metaphor. So myth, in that sense, is a metaphorical hint at a directly experienced truth, which is recognized as true by those who experience them. It is recognized as, how to say, obviously true. There is no doubt left, because you become acquainted with that truth directly and not through the intermediation of a narrative. Scientific truths tend to be truths that are indirect. They happen through the intermediation of a narrative, an equation, an explanation, a conceptual narrative. But some truths can be known by direct acquaintance, and those are really true. And there is no doubt left in your mind that they are true, even though you cannot word them, you cannot articulate them. So all you can do is a myth. So myths, in that sense, are the best way we have to communicate an ineffable truth known by direct acquaintance. This is what truth is and its relationship with myth. Truth is the direct acquaintance, the experience, and myth is the only way we have to try to hint at it, to point at it and say, there, look there. Don't look at my finger. Don't look at the literal meaning of the words. Look at what I am pointing to, trying to hint at with the words, but not to the words themselves. Now, belief is a sort of a degradation of that. Religions, in the very beginning, they are very alive in the immediate circle of the person or the people who have had that experience of direct acquaintance with truth. Religion is very vivid at that point. But as religions evolve, the link to that original acquaintance sort of becomes tenuous. And if it's not nurtured by a continuous renewal of the myth, a continuous re-energizing of the myth, it sort of decays into dogma, which is a belief system. It's not something that is hinting at anything. It's not pointing beyond itself. It's just saying, this is the truth. This is it. You don't need to look beyond the finger. The finger is the truth. Don't look at where the finger is pointing. It's not pointing anywhere. Just look at the finger. And that turns then into what is normally called belief in a pejorative sense. Of course, there is true belief. There is true belief in the sense of conviction, because you've had direct acquaintance with something and you know, and although you can't explain to somebody else what it is, you know. And if you try to word your way around it to convince other people, then you will get across as a believer. Because we live in a culture in which if something cannot be said, then it cannot be true. Which is a sort of an implied thing that permeates our culture. Nobody pays attention to it. We live in I'll repeat it because it's very important. We live in a culture in which we assume that if something cannot be said, then it cannot be true. This is absurd. It's completely logical. It flies in the face of everything we know about the evolution of language, how it came about. It's preposterous to think that the linguistic, symbolic, cognitive apparatus of a monkey that appeared on this planet 200,000 years ago only, less than a blink of an eye, is sophisticated enough to capture and say everything that is salient about what's going on. It's preposterous, but that's what we think. So some people who know come across as believers because they try to word, and then they come across as people who are just hand-waving nonsense. And there are a whole bunch of people who actually just believe in the dogma and have no further relationship with the original truth that has led to a myth that has decayed into the dogma.
So, in other words, they haven't seen the symbolic significance of the dogma. They just remain at that level of literal thinking.
Correct. I mean, there are two ways to get acquainted with something. Let's take the moon. It's an example I use in the book. You can know the moon by direct acquaintance. You've been there. You're Buzz Aldrin or Armstrong. You've been there. You know the moon by acquaintance. You know it's there. You know it's true. And nobody needs to convince you with a narrative, with a logical story that the moon exists. You've been there. And then there are those people who watch other people pointing at the moon, and then instead of looking at the finger, they look towards where the finger is pointing and they see the moon. They haven't been to the moon. They don't know the moon by direct acquaintance, but they've taken the hint, and that's the myth. When you take the hint from the myth, you look at where it's pointing, not at what it's saying in and of itself. The latter is like looking at the finger and missing out on the moon altogether. And then there are the people who watch the others pointing and say, oh, the finger is the truth. And they don't bother to look up.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the latter category is by far the largest today.
So would you say that that's the case for materialist science? I'm just thinking of what you say in the book about the fact that scientific myths are, there are scientific myths as well as religious myths, such as, you know, the Big Bang being a kind of scientific myth, for example. When would you say, you know, the myths of science are what you call deprived myths? In other words, myths that don't take us anywhere. And when are they true myths, and when they can be equated with religious myths?
Deprived myths sort of try to flatten reality. Materialism, which is not science, is a metaphysics. Mainstream physicalism is a technical word for it. It is a metaphysics. It makes a statement about what the world is, not about how it behaves. The latter is what science does. It tries to predict the behavior of the world. It doesn't make statements about what the world is. But materialism as a metaphysics is a deprived myth because it is a sort of, it's antithetical to implied meaning. What it says is that the world as we see it is the world as it is in and of itself. The world is not pointing at something behind itself or beyond itself. It's not hinting at anything. It is its own meaning. What you see is what you get, and that's all there is to it. Now, this contradicts a lot of science today, foundations of physics, neuroscience of consciousness, broader cognitive neuroscience is also contradicted by this. We know that the world as we see cannot be the world as it is in and of itself. We know that for a fact. It's an established theoretical and empirical fact. But that's what the metaphysics of materialism says. So it's telling you the world has no meaning. it is its own meaning. What you see is all there is to it. While other metaphysics would say the world is an image, it's an appearance of something else. It's the way a deeper layer of reality looks like to observation from a certain perspective. So the world itself becomes a myth because it becomes imbued with semantic meaning. It's not the end of the story. It is pointing at something beyond itself, in the same way that an image points at the phenomenon it is an image of. For instance, flames are images of a microscopic process of oxidation called combustion. You can have combustion without flames. Some alcohols burn without flames, no flames at all. But when you see flames, you know there is combustion. So the flame is not the whole story. It's a superficial appearance of a complicated chemical process of oxidation that's happening underneath, releasing a lot of energy, which leads to ionization and plasma formation, which then is the appearance of flames. So we know flames are not all there is to it. They are appearances. The problem is that we forget that the rest of the world too is an appearance. Everything we call material is a superficial image, an extrinsic appearance of something else going on, by definition, non-material, at a deeper layer of reality. So the world itself becomes mythological. It's a set of images that beg for interpretation. It's a mystery surrounding us, and a mystery we are immersed in and planted into, and it demands interpretation. It's clamoring for interpretation, which is what materialism denies it. It says you don't need to interpret it, it's all there is to it. The image is the phenomenon, there's nothing underneath it. There's nothing it is an image of. So in that sense, materialism is a very deprived myth. It flattens reality by denying the mythological aspect that is inherent to reality. Science is something else. We elevate science to a kind of metaphysics, but and many scientists do that, many famous scientists even, but that's a mistake. Science has nothing to say about what the world is. It only has something to say about how the world behaves, how nature behaves. And sometimes, well, often, almost all the time, it leverages what we call convenient fictions as explanatory devices. For instance, when Newton talked about gravity, this invisible force acting instantaneously at a distance between celestial bodies and locking them together, or pulling an apple down to the earth or on Newton's head, as the case may have been, that was a convenient fiction. There is no such invisible magical force acting instantaneously at a distance. We know that. But the world behaves as if there were such a force. So gravity is a convenient fiction. Elementary subatomic particles are convenient fictions. I've worked at CERN. I've hunted down for the most famous elementary subatomic particle, the Higgs boson. We never see a Higgs boson. A Higgs boson never interacts with a detector. And even if it did, all we would see is a histogram on a computer screen. A particle is a metaphor. Even theoretically, we know there are no such things as particles. There are only patterns of excitation of an underlying quantum field, which is itself a convenient fiction, because a quantum field is a vacuum. It's literally nothing. It's defined as the nothing that, when excited, produces patterns of excitation that we call elementary subatomic particles, and the world is built out of that. These are all convenient fictions, and they are very valid, because if you grant them some form of epistemic reality, not ontological, epistemic reality, you sort of have a coherent, empirically substantiated narrative about how nature behaves. So they're very useful. The problem is that many scientists forget that we are dealing with convenient fictions.
Yeah.
And they start thinking that it's all literally the case. And that's a very, very primary, childish philosophical mistake.
Which is the same as fundamentalist religious thought, of course.
Equally bad. It destroys the myth in the same way. It flattens the myth.
Yes.
Because it tells you it's not pointing at anything. It's the literal truth. Now you just destroyed it. It's like saying there is only the finger, don't look at the moon.
Absolutely. To move to a slightly more sort of religious perspective, I think people would be very interested to know a little bit more about what mind at large actually means. You know, what is this force of mind at large, and how does it relate to a personal God as experienced, say, in religions such as Christianity?
So what is this universal consciousness? I usually define mind at large more restrictively. Mind at large is the part of universal consciousness that is left behind once you've accounted for all living beings. So what is left of mind beyond the minds of living beings is mind at large. And universal consciousness is the sum total of mind at large plus the minds of all living beings. You know, different people would understand universal consciousness in a different way. If you have some experience with meditation and non-dual avenues to knowledge, everything I'm going to say now is untrue in a certain way and true in another sense. And I can, because we are dealing with things that are ineffable, it's impossible for me to neatly and unambiguously give you a story that makes sense of all this. So bear with me. There is a sense in which what I'm about to say is true and another sense in which is untrue. If you are into introspection and you have experience with meditation, mind at large is your subjectivity. It's what's left of you when you are not playing that narrative of a personal self. I am that person who was born that day, married that other person, who does this for a living and has these children and lives in that place. When this little wool ball of personal narratives dissolves and you're left with just the experiencer, just with raw subjectivity, that's universal consciousness. It's what you are, it's what everybody is. It is that pure field of subjectivity within which everything you call real happens, and also everything you call unreal. Now, for many scientists, this is a terrible answer. They just cannot wrap their heads around it, because for them, mind is personal. There is nothing beyond the personal mind. There is no such a thing as impersonal subjectivity. So for them, I give another answer. You can best visualize universal consciousness as empty space. If you remove everything from space, what you're left with is universal consciousness, empty space. Now notice that empty space isn't even space, because space is a relative concept. You know the space between two things because these two things have different positions in space. And then there is a certain distance, a certain amount of distance you have to cover to get from one to the other. But when there is nothing, you can't even move, because wherever you move, it's the same place you left, because there is nothing in that space. You don't have a reference framework of relative positions to talk about space. So universal consciousness is empty space. And in that sense, because it's empty, it's not even spatial. So for scientists, that's the best way to try to sort of help the person walk down that path. But if I want to be as careful as possible, which I'm not trying to do in this audience because of the theme of today, but if I were giving a normal interview, I would always be thinking about how people can take me out of context and make a mess of what I'm trying to say and misportray what I'm trying to say. So for them, I would say universal consciousness is a spatially unbound field of subjectivity that underlies all nature. Now, that's probably totally unsatisfying for people like you, but for a lot of other people, it's like, oh, we can take this guy seriously.
No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I'm quite curious to know how you equate that with, in Platonic traditions, you know, the one, because in those traditions, obviously, there's a difference between one and mind as consciousness. I mean, how does this, you know, the unspeakable oneness that Plotinus would speak of, how does that fit into the theme of this empty consciousness?
There is a lot of confusion around the words we used to talk about mind or consciousness. In the East, they have enough subtlety of introspection that they have come up with a number of different words to specify what they actually mean. We do not have that sophistication in the Western tradition. Our tradition lacks so much sophistication when it comes to introspective insight that we even use the words mind and consciousness interchangeably, which I do. And the reason I do it, it's because that's the Western philosophical tradition. Descartes used the words mind and consciousness as synonymous. So I do that as well. But ultimately, there are many, many layers of manifestation of what you could call raw consciousness, or what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness. And that's the Western unambiguous technical term when we want to refer to the most basic, fundamental layer of consciousness. It's phenomenal consciousness. It's that which experiences, raw experience. It doesn't need to have any higher level mental function whatsoever. It's just pure raw experience without self-awareness, reflection, explicit introspection, metacognition. None of these higher level mental functions need to apply to phenomenal consciousness, which is the lowest, most basic level. So when I talk about universal consciousness, what I mean is universal phenomenal consciousness. When I talk about mind, what I mean is phenomenal consciousness. Now, there are other things that people use the word consciousness for. There are neuroscientists today active in the world that deliberately conflate phenomenal consciousness with what we call meta-consciousness. Meta-consciousness not only experiences, but knows that it experiences. We are capable of phenomenal consciousness. I don't think my cat is. My cat is not stopping suddenly and think, wow, I am a thinking being. I experience. No, the cat's not doing that. But the cat surely experiences the flavor of food and the colors of the world and the warmth of, being pet and cuddled with. So we mix all this, and the question is, when ancient philosophers, post or even pre-Socratic, when they use terms like Greek terms like psyche, what did they really mean? Which of these different manifestations of raw consciousness did they mean? When Schopenhauer talked about the will, did he mean phenomenal consciousness, or did he mean mind in the sense of reflective mind? Now, I think we can derive answers, correct answers, if we read through what these people wrote very carefully. I've done that with Schopenhauer. I've done that with Jung. Peter Kingsley has done that for Parmenides and Empedocles. So we can derive the answers. The problem is that a lot of people have an axe to grind. So they will represent these ancient writings in whatever way fits their message best. And you see that in academia. I mean, Schopenhauer has been made a caricature of Schopenhauer by the leading academics or the leading academic in Schopenhauerian studies today. The Schopenhauer he edits and translates and portrays is not the historical Schopenhauer. It's a fiction character that was put together to make someone's career, probably, or to fit somebody's, ossified patterns of interpretation. So I gave you a long answer without really addressing your question.
It's like peeling back layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, isn't it? Of kind of cultural assumptions, translation assumptions.
And even look, even the original writers themselves. I mean, let's go back to beyond Plotinus, back into the past. Let's go to Parmenides. He was the first one to talk about the oneness. And he described the one as a sphere. But if you read through him carefully, it's a metaphor he's talking about. It's not an actual sphere. It didn't mean that way. But you see people today, or in the past, the recent past, Bertrand Russell, who had the supreme arrogance to interpret and criticize every significant philosopher in history in one thick book. I mean, if there is a definition of arrogance, it's what Russell did. He sort of criticizes Parmenides on this notion that, of course, oneness cannot be a sphere, because the concept of a sphere only happens within a broader space that provides a spatial reference for you to determine a radius. So therefore, Parmenides was full of crap. Yeah. I mean, this is a travesty. I mean, this is one of the world's most respected philosophers who was completely unconscious of the possibility that he just didn't get it. But he thought he got it better, and then wrote an enormous book criticizing all these ancient philosophers from the position of a supreme judge that simply knows better. And yeah, that's the world we live in.
Well, so you also mention, in your book about how, I mean, this relates to what you've just been saying about how, in our very intellectual sort of post-enlightenment age, we have our very strong intellect to grapple with, obviously, but we also need to accommodate our, I think you call them our soul's intuitions, of the truth behind the truth, behind the truth, behind the truth. Does everyone need to do this, do you feel? And I'm thinking of like artists, visionaries, poets who seem to be able to immediately get to this, immediately grasp this truth behind the truth. The idea that part of us has to get out of the way, what of this other part of us to sort of come in. Just wondering how you see the relationship between the emotional grasping of the truth, which is a religious sense and sort of pious sense, and the intellectual side of us, which then needs to have some kind of relationship with that pious sense that was not, the case to our ancestors.
Well, no, I'm not going to preach recipes. I mean, people live whatever way they want. But what I would say is the following. I'll say two things. One is there is something to be seen if you can look behind or below the intellect. There is something there. It's not a realm of hollowness and emptiness. There is rich stuff. So it may be in your best interest to try to have a peek. I mean, what have you got to lose? It's not like you're amputating your intellect. You're just setting it aside for a moment and doing a little experiment. If you're capable at all of doing that experiment, a lot of people are so married to the intellect that they cannot even conceive of something that is not intellectual. The other thing I would say is, if our civilization is to survive, I think it's a good idea that a good chunk of us develop the ability to do that. Because a purely conceptually driven narrative can be quite dangerous, and history has plenty of evidence for it. If you are not sympathetically and empathetically linked to the world around you through your roots, as opposed to through the concept going around in your head, you are liable to cause great damage and be the vehicle to great evil. But yeah, I would say you live your life the way you want, but there is something to be seen there. The intellect is one of our cognitive faculties, one of our mental faculties. We have many others. And the intellect is the youngest sibling of the entire set. We are anatomically human for about 200,000 years, give or take 50,000. But even Homo sapiens of 200,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, did not have an intellect. What we call an intellect is the ability to think symbolically. It's the ability to replace elements of reality with a concept that points at that element. Yeah. The technical word in paleoanthropology for this is symbolic thinking. And we only expressed our ability to think symbolically between 50 and 30,000 years ago, give or take, depending on which evidence you believe more, or which scholar you think is more credible. But this is less than the blink of an eye. This was yesterday. I mean, the intellect it's not only the youngest, it's a newborn. It's taking its first breath right now. And there are very much older siblings in the set of mental faculties at our disposal, and the others are more embodied. The others are not amenable to being translated into conceptual narratives, but they are rooted into reality. Because no, we are not floating in a vacuum. We didn't pop out of nowhere. We arose out of this world. And by virtue of being rooted into this world, we continue to be alive. If you pull the roots out, we die very quickly, literally. And it's naive to think that that root system that is so old, so ancient, so much older than this flimsy intellect, that the entire root system has no sensory or cognitive aspects to it, is stupendously naive. So yeah, you have it, you have those faculties. Why would you decree that they are not there and live without them? You're condemning yourself to a life of poverty.
So that brings us on to the question of the symbol then. And I did want, you know, to say so quickly, but I did want to move to the whole question of divinatory practice and astrology, you know, within this symbolic, the question of knowing through the symbol, because obviously throughout the ages, diviners have been using symbols in order to in access to what you might call the obfuscated mind in some way, through asking questions, through oracular procedures, etc. So, you know, if the whole, if the cosmos is symbol, the whole world is symbol, nature is symbol, diviners will use very specific things for symbols, as planets or tea leaves or whatever. How do you see, you know, the role of the diviner in activating, perhaps, you know, the symbolic faculty? I mean, how would you understand astrology, for example, as a way of gaining some understanding behind the veil?
I think, as any myth, a great disservice has been done to astrology when we literalized it, when we read the Sunday paper and say, okay, what is in for me this week? I don't think the planets are literally irradiating some kind of physical force field or energy or influence of some sort that is sort of co-determining what happens in your life. But mythically speaking, the idea that the configuration of the night sky at the moment you were born has some form, ineffable form of kinship with who you are, is an intriguing idea, isn't it? Because that's the configuration of the world you are born into at the moment you are born, and you are a part of that world. Richard Tarnas wrote an interesting book about it. I forgot the title.
Cosmos and Psyche, I think.
Was it Cosmos and Psyche, right? The other one was The Passion of the Western Mind, but that's not it. It's Cosmos and Psyche, yeah. It's a thoughtful book that does honor to astrology as a myth, not as a literal pseudo-scientific story of influences that could determine the minor details of your life in the next week. Jung also wrote a lot about what he called synchronicities, which have to do with divination, because what are diviners doing? They are using a sort of a small system that they assume behaves in a way correlated with a larger system, which they're trying to predict. So by looking at the behavior of the smaller system, they make predictions about what's going to happen in the larger system. So in ancient China, when you throw the sticks of the I Ching, what you're saying is that there is something about the quality of time right now that correlates with the pattern of the sticks when they fall, and also correlates with your life. And so what they are trying to do is not to say that the sticks influence your life or your life influences the sticks. What they're trying to say is time influences both. So by looking at the pattern of the small, you can make predictions about the patterns of the larger, because both are manifestations of a kind of a fractal system that unfolds in both the sticks and in your life in self-similar ways. And that's the very concept of fractality. The patterns of the small are reflected back in the patterns of the large. And for Jung, there was substance to this. It was not a obviously silly thing to do, because Jung understood the entire world to be a sort of a visible expression of the collective unconscious. So the physical world itself is what the collective unconscious looks like from a certain perspective. You can peek at the collective unconscious, not only by watching your dreams, your deeper dreams, but also by watching the world around you. And he clearly did not see an ontological fundamental difference between the two. Both are psychic and both are objective, in the sense that you cannot control your deeper dreams and you cannot control the world. You can only witness them in mind, in the psyche, as experiences. And then Jung said, okay, if the world at large, the physical world, is a manifestation of the collective unconscious, and we know that the collective unconscious behaves according to certain templates of behavior called the archetypes, then the behavior of nature is archetypal as well. And therefore, you have a situation in which your own mind is unfolding according to certain templates that are the same as the templates governing the unfolding of the world around you. So it shouldn't be surprising that there are correlations between the two, between your visions, your fantasies, your emotions, your dreams, and the world outside, because both are sort of the unfolding of these universal templates called the archetypes, or in the Platonic wording, the ideal forms. The ideal forms are both in the physical world and in your own inner universe, your own inner mind. And so they correlate. So from that perspective, what a diviner is doing is he's triggering a manifestation of the archetypes when he throws the sticks of the I Ching, or he pulls the cards of the tarot, or whatever. He's triggering a manifestation of the archetypes in that small system to make a prediction about what archetype is dominating right now, and therefore what can we expect about the behavior of the world at large. I reserve judgment about the verifiable accuracy of any of this, which doesn't mean that I am dismissing it or believing it. I just reserve judgment. I mean it literally. I have an impulse to reject it, because this is the kind of thing that we can set up an experiment to check whether it holds water or not. And the fact that these things have been done for so long, and yet there are no incontrovertible set of experiments proving it. Even Jung ran an experiment and his experiment failed. Sort of makes me sort of think that operationally it's not useful. It is philosophically interesting, may hold some water, but operationally it's not useful. At the same time, I throw the I Ching once a year on the 31st of December. And it has never failed. It has been remarkably accurate. But the thing is, it's one person doing an experiment once a year. Statistically, this is negligible.
Well, I think you've put your finger on the point that, a lot of us here are astrologers, and we would completely agree with you on the fact that trying to quantify astrology or trying to turn it into a concrete predictive activity is to completely deny its actual truth, which is purely symbolic and unique and in the moment. And I think, oh gosh, there's so much to talk about, because that brings us onto the whole question of the daimonic and how that, acts within the process of divination, which takes it into a completely different sphere from the predictive, and perhaps leads us more to what we might call the prophetic, which is a much deeper, truer voice that speaks from somewhere else. So I think most of us would be in absolute agreement that scientific measurement of divination as predictive in any way is a complete red herring, and it's not going to go anywhere. But if we are looking at the cosmos as a symbol that leads to deeper metaphorical glimpses of something underneath, then it's a whole different ballgame. But we haven't got time to go into that. Mary and Louise, is there anything you wanted to ask Bernardo before we open out a bit to others?
I would, but I'm going to let the questions come in, because I know that they're going to start sort of building, and I'd like to give other people a chance to ask. But I just wanted to put this to Bernardo, going back a little bit about what you said about the older siblings of the intellect. And you described that that we sort of overlook them. But she said, could you describe a little bit more about what these pre-intellect faculties are or were?
it's
siblings.
difficult to do that because we are immediately appealing to the intellect to sort of divide the cake and give names to everybody. So we recognize all the siblings and the family trees. I don't think that works very well, but I will do what I can. What happens on liminal states of mind gives you, if you pay attention to those, because most people don't even know those liminal states of mind happen at all. Immediately upon their happening, people forget that they happened. And so if you ask them, have you ever had a liminal state of mind? They say, I don't even know what you're talking about, while this is happening several times a day. On the edge of sleep, either before you fall asleep or just after you wake up, especially when it's not night sleep, when it's an afternoon nap, what comes to your mind at those liminal, edgy states, at the edge of something, on the verge of something else, those are the moments when these other mental faculties sort of see a gap and rush in. But again, I am guilty of that as well. More often than not, I forget that these things happened like less than a second, literally less than a second after. And when I manage to remember, then I go like, darn, how many times have I forgotten this or didn't take this seriously? Also, what happens in your mind, and this is a big one, and this is probably the royal road to non-intellectual insight, unfortunately, and intellectual insight as well. When you're out of yourself, when circumstances of life push you to the brink of desperation, not quite to desperation, because then cognitively you become completely dysfunctional. But when you are on the edge of despair, when you cannot hold it together, when you think it's all hopeless now and it's all downhill, and stuff happens that if you pay attention, if you maintain some sort of presence to stay with that energy, not run away from it, not say, oh, I shouldn't be this desperate. No, stay with that energy and pay attention, introspective attention. Stuff happens there that is profoundly convincing and real and alive and not intellectual at all. Because you cannot tell yourself immediately afterwards in words what it is that you sort of grokked. You can look at in the mirror forever and you're not going to be able to word it to yourself. And because of that, we forget it a lot, because what we tend to remember is the story we tell ourselves, not the thing that gave birth to the story. It's very difficult to hold on to a non-intellectual insight. It's like trying to hold on to a scent. It's very obvious when it's present and you're feeling it. But when it's not there, scents are tenuous. It's very difficult to hold on to that memory of a scent. So non-intellectual insights and cognition is like, it's scent-like. It's really like a scent. I've seen somebody else using this word as well, scent. I forgot who it was, but I thought, oh, this guy is on the ball. This guy he's been there. I forgot who it was. So yeah, liminal states, edge of despair, when your carefully constructed and very tight ego narrative is unraveling against your own will, because your will is the egoic will. It gives you a glimpse to that. Contact with nature, preferably when you're immersed. Like if you go to the sea, now go knee deep into the water, at least if you don't want to take a plunge because it's cold. And just be in the moment, and stuff comes to mind, stuff happens. Dream thinking or nightly thinking. We know now that not all nightly experiences are dreams. You're probably experiencing the whole night. You just don't remember when you wake up. Only a small part of that is dreaming, but you have sleep thinking. Because it's not metacognitive, you don't hold on to it, but you can develop a discipline to sort of stay with your sleep thinking and sort of fish that fish out of the water of sleep and take the fish with you. Try to hook it and take the fish with you. It's very difficult because we tend to immediately try to intellectualize it and then you let the fish go. But you can train yourself to sort of try to take some of that ineffable stuff with you, and then regard it on the mirror of reflection after you are awake, but not during the process itself, because reflection would just destroy it. You bring the intellect into it. I'm not against the intellect, by the way. You're talking to somebody with 2 PhDs, one in the humanities, one in the hard sciences. I'm not at all against the intellect. I just know enough about it that I know that it can be dysfunctional, and it can deprive you from a lot of what you inherently have. So all these hints that I'm trying to give you is how to see through the screen of conceptual thinking that tends to overwhelm us.
And I think in some ways, I don't know if you'd agree, but there's an element of surrender involved in that, of that allowing that state, or believing that those states and those ways of being are just as valid, if not more so, than being stuck in this, you know, I suppose what Ian McGilchrist would call the sort of left hemisphere overdrive most of the time that people tend to run on and live through.
So some people have that naturally. They don't need to surrender. That it's how they are normally put together, and they normally are not taken seriously by society and by the culture.
Thank you, Bernardo. We had another question. To my understanding, knowledge by acquaintance occurs upon an encounter between the agent and the collective unconscious. But then again, I think collective unconscious is a loaded word, and hopefully we'll have better descriptions for the contents of it. What does Bernardo think about the components of the collective unconscious?
Yeah. It's the whole of existence. I mean, how can we even begin to enumerate that? Look, the agent behind the collective unconscious and the agent in you is the same agent, even though that agent is telling itself different stories about what it is. But agency is an appeal to active subjectivity, and it's the same. And if you can understand what I said, not merely through words, but through direct acquaintance, and it's the only way to understand what I said, because if you just say, well, the agent in me is the same agent in you, you go like, oh, yeah, perhaps, no? A nice intellectual abstraction. But it's really, it is really the same agent. So that was my preface to the answer. It's the same agent. So there is no way you can be something else as an agent that will meet the collective unconscious. It's a question of which stream of experiences of that one agent becomes reflected and then recognized. Because for as long as you don't re-represent cognitively that stream of experiences on the mirror of reflection, you experience them and not know that you experience them. Now, for the rest, yeah, it's collective unconscious. What are the components? I don't think the collective unconscious has proper parts. And now I'm using a technical mereology term. It's holistic. Parts is something that arises out of intellectual thinking. It's a nominal carving of the totality of the world for convenience. In other words, it's arbitrary. Where does the car end and the road begins? Where does the river end and the ocean begins? All these partitionings are made nominally, arbitrarily for convenience. So we can refer to a river, so we can refer to a car as a subset of this whole, but that subset is not a proper subset. It's not a proper part. It's an arbitrarily defined set of pixels of one image. So from that perspective, not only is it impossible to name all the components of the collective unconscious as existence itself, there are no proper components. It's just an arbitrary way of dividing the cake. So in that sense, it's as many or as few as convenience dictates. You can say there are countless components of the collective unconscious, or you can say there are only 10, or you can say there is only one. Jung himself, he sort of hinted at this because while he named many of the archetypes, he also said there are infinite archetypes. And by the way, the archetypes have to be differentiated from the expression of the archetypes. The expression of an archetype is not the archetype. He said, literally, the archetype is empty. And I could speak for half an hour about what is meant by that, but it gives you an idea that even the guy who came up with the concept of the collective unconscious was keenly aware that insofar as he had to use words to talk, he inevitably was hand-waving, but he made it very explicit that he was hand-waving.
Bernardo, in your book on Jung, you have been predicting that the direction of science will in the future change into an idealist direction. Could you say something about that?
I think truth isn't fragile. There is only so long a culture can fool itself with a completely unattainable story. And we have been doing that for about 400 years now. And there were good reasons to fool ourselves in the beginning. And in the beginning, we knew we were fooling ourselves. Denis Diderot, when he wrote, one of the writers of L'Encyclopédie, one of the foundational documents of the Enlightenment, he's on record saying materialism is at least incomplete, but we need to use it against the church. So here's somebody saying it doesn't work, but we need it because otherwise they will burn us at the stake, which they did to Bruno not too long before Diderot. So in the beginning, we knew we were fooling ourselves. We knew this was a very bad story, but it carved out a space for scientists to do science without upsetting the church, because the church was preoccupied with the soul. Now, if you look at the etiology of the word, soul comes from the Greek psyche, and psyche means not only soul, it means mind, experience. So the church was busy with experience, which is everything, and the church knew that very well. So when Descartes said, well, there is the soul and there is this other thing called matter, and we scientists, we are not working on the soul. We have nothing to say about the soul. We only have something to say about matter. The church guys probably thought they're talking about something beyond experience. All there is experience. So, okay, these idiots, let them fool themselves. We don't even need to burn them at the stake because they're obviously busy with some, abstraction that is not part of what matters. But then at some point in the 19th century, because of certain psychological dynamics that others have written about, even I wrote one paper about, we started taking a story that we knew was flawed. We started taking it very seriously indeed. And that had to do with the loss of soul and the need to fluid compensate for the absence of meaning in our mind, particularly for the elite, the intellectual elite. Their loss of soul led to what psychology calls fluid compensation, an attempt to replace a lost source of meaning, which was religion, which is the ultimate source of transcendent meaning to everything that happens in our lives. They had to replace, because they gave up on that, they had to replace that with something else. And psychologically, there are at least 4 ways to fluid compensate for a lost source of meaning. One is self-validation, when you sort of regard yourself as a small elite better than the rest. That gives you a sort of proxy source of meaning, very precarious, but it sort of keeps you going without killing yourself. Another one is closure. And this one we all know. When we lost a loved one, we need at least to know the circumstances, why that person died, and bury that person. We need closure as an alternative, precarious source of meaning for the loss of that person. There is a list of 4 or 5. And fluid compensation dictated that the elite would have to compensate by finding closure. In other words, a scientific theory of a dead material world that explained everything. And by self-validation, by regarding themselves as an elite that had the answers that the other poor, ignorant, gullible souls could not even contemplate. And that dynamism has led to, Darwin and Nietzsche's God is Dead, to early 20th century positivism. But it unraveled starting in the 60s. It began to unravel. And since then, we are sort of moving with the inertia of that. You don't stop a train so powerful that has influenced the psyche of an entire civilization. You don't stop that train very quickly. And although quantum mechanics in the early 20th century arose together with positivism already as its antidote, and they both arose at the same time. And although some of the leading figures of positivism changed their minds completely later in their lives, we still carry that inertia in our culture. But it is waning. It is going to change because truth is not fragile. We live in it. We are immersed in it. Even if we don't recognize it, we are breathing and moving within it at all times. We are bound to stumble upon it at some point. And arguably, we've been stumbling on it for over 40 years now, since the late 70s, through all kinds of experiments, confirmed and reconfirmed, that contradict the idea that the world is something outside mind and it's out there and has nothing to do with the qualities of experience. Today, I'm involved in publishing. I'm a publisher of If Books. I'm a publisher of the new Essential books. I'm the head of Essential Foundation. We publish stuff. And publishers know it has become nearly impossible to find a physicalist or technically materialist philosopher willing to come to a debate to defend physicalism. They don't do that anymore. Most physicalists, they will make statements to the media or interviews that just take cheap shots. But then you say, okay, let's discuss this more in depth. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the logic, the internal logic of physicalism. Let's see if it holds any water. Let's do that in public. You don't find them. It's been about 10 years that this doesn't happen anymore. The last decade saw the end of physicalists willing to debate. And the ones that may be willing to debate are arguably not physicalists anymore, because if you understand what they put forward as physicalism, it has little to do with the word. Whatever it is, it's not physicalism anymore. It's some highly abstract way of sort of pushing experience under the label we call physical entities. Why would you do that? Because this is victory by redefining words. Whatever the nature of reality is, we will call it physical, and then physicalism wins. Congratulations. If that's what you're doing, you're bound to arrive at something unfalsifiable by mere word redefinition. And it is happening. I don't want to name names, but if you pay attention to what is being published today, both in the technical media and in popular books by proper scientists, you will see that what is now falling under the banner of physicalism has nothing to do with what any of us would mean colloquially by the word physical or material. So yeah, it's winning by word redefinition. That I predict this is what's going to happen. In 20 years, we will live under physicalism, but any one of us today looking at that will say, this is anything but physicalism. We just redefined the word to mean whatever it is that is going on.
What makes Bernardo think we will solve abiogenesis?
Abiogenesis is the rise of life from non-life. It's how did the first living organism arise? It wasn't born from something else. It didn't arise by a cell dividing. It arose from something non-living. All evidence suggests, well, indicates that this is what has happened, because the non-living universe seems to have existed for a lot longer than the fossils tell us life has existed. It's a problem we have not solved. We have flirted with solving it. Craig Venter has managed to synthesize a molecule of DNA on a machine, then going to a living cell, plucking out the DNA from the nucleus of the cell and implanting his synthesized DNA. And lo and behold, the cell behaved like the synthesized DNA would tell it to behave. It became a different living organism. But he also started from a living cell. Nobody has managed to start from something non-living and get to something living. So I don't underestimate the difficulty involved here. I think it is a very difficult problem, and there are perhaps some fundamental things we yet don't understand, and we will need to understand before we can do that. And some of these things that we need to understand are likely to have strong metaphysical significance. we may need to part with materialist assumptions, hidden materialist assumptions, in order to truly understand what exactly is DNA, how does life emerge. I mean, today we think DNA is what builds the entire body, and it cannot be. DNA builds proteins. It doesn't put proteins together in the form of a body. What you get with DNA is a brick factory. It produces all kinds of bricks, but somebody has to put the bricks together to build a cathedral. So that same jump is the jump we haven't yet made between DNA as a brick factory and a living organism in which those proteins are put together in a certain way to create a living organism. So discovering what covers that gap may have to do with what we need to understand to create life from non-life. However, I do think it is fundamentally possible. And I say that because it obviously has happened at least once, right? If it has happened at least once, then fundamentally, in principle, it can happen again. So I think in principle, we will be able to do that. I don't think it requires the energy of a pulsar to happen, because life arose on this planet very far away from any pulsar. It has arose with a very average sun in the neighborhood, with very average elements. So I don't think it's fundamentally impossible. And I honestly and personally believe we will be able to do it.
I just think it might be interesting to just go back to your experience, Bernardo, that you talk about in More Than Allegory, when you give us a contemporary myth where you meet the other, this whatever the other is. And one of the things I was thinking about was, what was that experience for you, and how true? I mean, it reminded me very much of a kind of channeled sort of story, very much along the lines of like Diane Fortune's cosmic origin. And when you were undergoing that myth, that story, was that a dream for you? Was it real? Is it fiction? And how can we, start to move in that direction? I mean, that whole mythic realm that you're trying to introduce to us in a new way with a new myth. I'm absolutely intrigued to know, did you meet the other, and who was he?
Look at what we are doing. And this is not to blame you or whoever is asking the question. I'm part of that as well. I have the same tendencies. Here are we trying to get the literal story behind what I told as a myth, because we don't take myths seriously. We need the bloody literal story. And we are doing that, even though the book is precisely about the need to not do that. And I wrote that myth precisely because we need a myth and not a literal story. Here we are. Now, what's the literal story? I get this question a lot.
Right.
But let this serve as a mirror to us, me included, because I'm guilty of this as well. That we are doing precisely the thing the book calls on us not to do. The book calls on us to take the myth as a myth. It doesn't matter what the literal story was that motivated that. Was there a literal story? There was a literal story. Do I want to tell it? No, it would destroy my book if I would tell the literal story. It will probably impress some of you, but it's not. Look, that myth is a highly stylized version of something that happened, which had, for me, the insight value that I try to convey through the myth. In other words, it was as if that happened as I wrote. Did it happen literally as I wrote? No. Did something happen? Yes. Myths don't come out of nowhere. It's not something that you sit in your armchair and you make it up. Myths happen to you. You don't make them happen. We are victims. Every founder of any religious tradition has been a victim. Many scientists are victims. Many philosophers are victims. Many common people are victims. Actually, that's the vast majority of people who have engaged with a myth. They are victims. They're common people who fell victims to a myth. and then even literalized for themselves afterwards, and then went out and said, I am Jesus. Yeah, that would be the mythical version, but even they themselves take it literally. So is there another? Yeah, mythically there is the other. Almost not mythically. The other is a very palpable presence. And did the message in that myth arise from acquaintance? Yeah. But did it happen literally, as I'm saying? Of course not. That would defeat the purpose. I mean, if that had happened, I would be writing in an academic journal. I wouldn't be writing a book about myths.
So the other, and of course there are many others. There's, you know, there's the whole, what have been mythologized as the daimons and the intelligences and the angels and the saints, and, you know, the whole cosmos is full of these others. Are they, would you understand them as elements of minds at large that have been conceptualized as particular spiritual intelligences? How would you understand them?
I think the risk of applying too many qualifiers and descriptors to the idea of the other is that we will literalize them. We say, oh, there is spirit A, there is spirit B, and they live in these different realms and they have these different missions. Things start getting pretty flaky and dangerous when you go down that slippery road. The other is it arises from the recognition that the ego is not the only inhabitant of the mind. There is somebody else at home. And this is one of the most self-evident, obvious constatations that a human being can make. And yet most of us don't, which is a cultural artifact. Previous cultures always recognized the presence of, I use the word agents, although there is only one agent, quasi-agencies within the mind of an individual that the individual, i.e. the ego, didn't identify with. And we all have that. We all have forces operating in our own minds, driving our feelings, driving our thoughts, driving our actions. And these forces are not us. They don't have our personal well-being in mind as the driving factor of what they do. And the ego does. That's all the ego does. The ego has one agenda: self-preservation. It cares for nothing else. Self-preservation, self-comfort, happiness for itself. And yet we get caught thinking and feeling and doing things that have little to do with self-preservation, things that we are driven to do or think or feel or act out. So these are the actions of the other than the ego. Jung called it personality number 2. Socrates called it the daimon. I mean, you have, many of you will call it spiritual presence, probably. I don't know what this group, what the background of this group is. There are many ways to refer to it, but it's important that we keep in mind that all of these names are fingers pointing at something and not a literal story, because that's when things really become flaky, is when we start categorizing and adding qualifiers and coming up with entire cartographies of the world of the other. And it's tricky because we have the tendency to literalize. We want to literalize. Look at the previous question. We want to literalize because we are in a culture that tells us if it's not literally true, then it's not true at all. There is no other way it can be true. While the point is precisely that there is other much richer ways that things can be true other than literally true. But in our heart of hearts, we don't really believe that. We think if it's not literally true, then it's not true. So we need to make it literally true in some complex way. And that's a pity. But yes, the other exists. You all know it.
Angela, I'm just going to leap in here because we've got more questions coming in. In More Than Allegory, you suggest that one who becomes aware of their own religion as myth, properly understood, can continue to believe in it as the big story. This creates a mere discomfort, brackets, cognitive dissonance. Can one really do more than behave as though they believe in it, as Peterson says about his relation to the Judeo-Christian God? He's referring to
believing as though is scientific belief. In science, we believe in our theoretical entities as though they were true. And we know that those are just convenient fictions. They are operationally useful, but they don't need to be true enough in and of themselves. Nature behaves as though they were true. It's irrelevant whether they are literally true, they're actually true or not, because we can predict the behavior of nature as if they were true. And that's all we need. We need to predict things and confirm the predictions through experiment. And only with the advance and the refinement of science, sometimes you need to replace an older convenient fiction with a new one. We've replaced the convenient fiction of Newton's invisible force of gravity with the convenient fiction of a space-time fabric that can bend and twist. This is another convenient fiction, but it's more amenable to modern day predictions than Newton's invisible force, but they are all convenient fictions. So believing as though is scientific belief, but scientific belief will not be transformative. Science is a very operational business. We want to predict nature, so we develop technology. Or we can predict risks to our safety in the future. Or we can retroactively make sense of things that went wrong in the past, so we can prevent them in the future. This is a very operational business. It has very little to do with how you feel within, whether your life is fulfilling or not, whether you are in touch with something transcendent or not, whether you perceive meaning in all the crap you have to go through in life or not. It has nothing to do with this. It's just like science, it's operational. So I don't think it is sufficient that one believes in one's religious myth just as though it were true, but in the heart of hearts, thinking it's actually not true. That's not what I said in the book. And what I said in the book is you have to believe a religious myth of your choice as though it were literally true. But you will know it's not literally true, but true in some other way. But in that other way, it is true. If you don't think it's true, even in some other way, then that's the belief of science. It's not transformative. It will mean nothing to you. You're not in the business of performing operational tasks when it comes to religion. You are in the business of relating to yourself and something transcendent from which you came. So you have to at least grant the possibility that it is true in some way, even though you know it's not literally true, as no myth is literally true. Otherwise, there would be no need for the myth. You would just tell an unambiguous conceptual story that is literally true. And the reason I say you have to believe it as though it were literally true, because we are in a culture that has influenced us, our psyche, so much, so strongly, from so early, since we were newborns, that has indoctrinated us to think that whatever is not literally true cannot be true at all in any other sense. That for you to have a relationship with the truth of your myth, you have to pretend that it is literally true. That's what I meant. Other cultures don't need this device that I propose at all. Other cultures know full well that actually many pre-literate cultures, if not all, they don't quite grasp this Western concept of literal truth. They don't quite grasp that for a Westerner, when we say time is a river, that this is not true. They go, what do you mean? Of course it is true. Not literally true, but of course it's true. But for them, the idea of something literal is difficult to fathom because the human mind operates through analogy. We are pattern matching minds. We recognize a pattern in different places, the same pattern. That's what the brain does. That's what neuronal networks do. That's what they are good at. Recognition of patterns, pattern matching things, matching everything to a pattern that has been recognized before. So in that sense, we are our thinking is fundamentally analogical. Because what is analogical thinking? Analogical thinking is recognizing the same pattern expressed in completely different forms. Time is a river. You're recognizing a pattern, the pattern of flow, which we happen to have a word for. So when in many other cultures, to say A is B means solely that there is something about A that is recognizable in a different form in B. And that's all you can say about anything. Language and thinking stops there. But in the West, we invented another level, which was very useful, by the way. It allowed us to develop technology and gain operational control over the planet. We devised this extra notion that there is something that is literally true. It's not only an analogy, it's not only the same pattern expressing itself in different ways that can be recognized in different instances. It is it. It's not an expression of, it's not another instance of, it is it. I'm saying exactly what it is, and all there is to say about it, I am already saying. There's nothing else to be said about it. This is a very recent, very Western thing that overwhelmed us to the point that we no longer can think analogically. And my invitation for people to believe their favorite religious myths as if they were literally true is only a concession to these cultural epidemics, to this culturally induced inability to think analogically again, to understand that the real truths of the matter can only be discerned through pattern matching, pattern recognition, and that our language and our concepts cannot corral reality to such an extent that there is nothing else left to be said about it after we tiled it with our conceptual structures.
Gosh, fascinating. Like everybody's quite quiet and digesting what you're saying there, Bernardo. I just want to leap in with a last question, if we can. Metaphor and communication depend upon us having some shared experience. For example, your example of the river is time. Are we making a world where communication is becoming more difficult because our experience is more virtual? On school curricula are more controlled and focused on the material perspective.
All communication, metaphoric or otherwise, particularly the ones that are not metaphoric, depend on shared experience. If I say here's a car, and I mean it literally, you only understand it if you have seen something called a car before. So you have to have a shared experience of a car. But for this audience, if I say a lepton has just crossed my head right now, which probably happened, almost certainly happened, it will mean nothing to you because you don't have the shared experience of what one means by a lepton. So all communication is dependent on shared experience, particularly literal communication, because then you need to have the precise shared experience of what is being meant. There is no room for you to extrapolate from other different experiences that can allow you to follow the communication, even if you don't quite have the same experience shared with the person saying something. You can still extrapolate from others. You can do that in metaphorical communication. Actually, arguably, this is the greatest power of metaphor, that it can appeal to the experiences that you did have to hint about an experience that you didn't have. That's the power of metaphor. It's this invitation to extrapolation. With literal communication, you don't have even that. You have to have the exact same experience. Otherwise, no, too bad for you. I was about to say something in Dutch. Too bad for you. So I think in that sense, metaphorical communication is the more robust by far. And you can argue that with the internet and social media, the power of literal communication is increasing because we have more opportunities to share literal experiences through the images and the sounds and the videos and all the stuff shared online. This only doesn't apply for the shared experience of smells. Even flavors, which are an instance of smells. Any small city in any Western country now will have restaurants from every part of the world. So even that is being shared. Smell is the holdout. It is the ultimate sense still. It's preserved and pristine. if you haven't been there, you cannot talk about it. But yeah, you could make the opposite argument of the question that social media is actually helping literal communication to expand at the cost of metaphorical communication, whose power and usage is precisely when you do not share exactly the same experience and you need to extrapolate from those that you did have.
I'm just thinking of the past couple of years, we've been bombarded by literalism and what we might call explanatory truth in relation to the pandemic, in relation to our bodies, in relation to how we deal with it. We seem to have had this massive onslaught of literal thinking about the body, for example. I mean, just as a sort of final question, really. I mean, how are we going to redeem this, Bernardo? How are we going to how can we work to counteract this force now that it seems to be gaining such a lot of hold in terms of how we see ourselves, the world, our bodies? How can we create a modern mystery school that's going to be integrative enough to, counteract this? How do you see the way forward?
I may sound initially pessimistic, but bear with me because it's not a pessimistic message that I'm about to try and share. The notion, even the question, how do we stop this, invests the ego with power it doesn't have. Look, if recipes and preaching solved anything, our problems would have been solved about 1900 years ago when Christianity expanded into, well, 1700 years ago, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. All the preaching and the recipes that were shared back then would have solved all of our problems. So what does history teach? Preaching and recipes don't help. We are part of nature, and nature has a way to spontaneously unfold in whatever direction it goes. Sometimes it's a great sunset. Sometimes it's a tornado that kills your family and destroys your house. We are in nature, and even what we do is part of nature. The idea that we have full conceptual egoic control over our feelings, thoughts, and actions is empirically false. It's very obviously false. Otherwise, somebody serving a life sentence in solitary confinement would also be the happiest person in the world, because that person would just choose to feel that that's the greatest situation one can be in and be overjoyed with the situation. But that's not how it works. We don't choose how we feel. We don't choose how we think. And we do choose many of our actions, but not all. Otherwise, there would never be self-destructive behavior or civilization-ending behavior, like so many instances of which we see around. So we are in for the ride in a transpersonal process. And in that process, the ego is at best a more or less autonomous tool, and at worst, a witness, and no more than a witness. So the idea, the sort of presupposition or the hope underlying the question you asked is that we have the power to do it if we only do the right things. We have the power to change if only we do the right things. And at a very abstract theoretical level, in a hypothetical world, you would be right, because if we all, or at least a large subset of us, would take this and that action, then we would change things. In that hypothetical world, you are correct. It's a physically coherent world in which, if those actions were taken, the result would be the desirable one. But we are part of the world. We don't get to choose these things, even if we wish that we did. Look, we don't even follow our New Year's resolutions, let alone what we need to do to change the world. You see, I think the best realistic option we have is twofold. Is to grant room to what nature wants to do through us. It's not us, it's something that nature wants to do through us. To grant legitimacy and room for that to happen, while we balance that out with our ability to reflect. There are two extremes here that are deadly. One is not granting what nature wants to do through us any legitimacy whatsoever, thinking that it doesn't exist, thinking that we are just egos. There is nobody else at home. There is no other. There is no diamond. There is no transpersonal force trying to express something through us. If you do that, you probably become sick, physically or otherwise. You certainly not have an easy ride in this life. You are in for a lot of self-blame, for depression, for anxiety, for anyway. So that's one extreme, and it's very dangerous to oneself. The other extreme is very dangerous to the world, which is when you just allow nature to manifest fully and instantaneously and totally spontaneously through you, without any sort of balancing force from your ability to reflect and pass value judgment. What are instances when people do that? Well, Hitler did not balance his daimon in any way whatsoever. He just gave carte blanche to his daimon, and the goal was positive. The goal was to secure the safety of the Germanic peoples and maximize their potential. But when that force of nature is not balanced out by reflection, it goes just as wrong as a tornado can destroy an entire city. These are forces of nature. They are morally ambiguous. And our giving expression to them without balancing them out is extraordinarily dangerous. So I think another way we become completely unbalanced. I've been in the corporate world. I'm not anymore, but I was there for about 25 years. And I worked not only in high technology, but did mergers and acquisitions. So I've been involved in the financial world at a fairly high level for a number of years. And money acquires such a numinous power sometimes in the world of high business, high technology, and you know, high finance, that it becomes daimonic. And sometimes people completely lose sight of what they want to do with the money they want to earn. It's not about what they want to do with the money. It's money for money's sake. And that's also, it's a storm, because you project numinous transpersonal value onto an entity that actually doesn't exist. Money doesn't really exist. It's a convenient fiction that helps us organize our collective work. When you project luminosity onto that, you open a channel of nature that's like a tsunami. If you don't use your reflection to sort of balance that out, you're also in for catastrophe. And that's what the financial world is doing. It's the overconsumption. It's the need for enrichment beyond reason, because it gets to a point where, you know, I mean, how many houses can you live? How many yachts can you actually use? I mean, right? Then you pass, what, 100 million, every dollar above that is pure power and luminosity. It's a religious drive. It has nothing to do with what money can buy anymore, because you cannot experience that anymore. So that's why I say, I think the way to go is to allow nature to express itself through us as tools, but with the balancing power of our unique ability to reflect, that invests us with moral responsibility that I don't think even God has.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we're in a state of tension, and we have to learn how to manage it, which seems to be the human condition. I think we're going to have to close there, but thank you so much, Bernardo.
My pleasure.
We could go on for hours and hours, and maybe at another occasion we'll be able to, but there's lots.
It's really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thanks for your being here.
There's lots of lovely comments as well, Bernardo, but yeah, thank you very much.
We haven't been able to answer everybody's comments.
Yeah, sorry.
It's just one of those things, but yeah, we'll hopefully do it again. So thank you.
All right, thanks guys.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.